Watson. I'm the Director of Library and Information Systems here at Payne Theological Seminary. Right now we are honored enough to be hosting the Smithsonian Exploring Human Origins exhibit. It's a traveling exhibit. We are the first HBCU and the first private institution to be hosting this exhibit. And in conjunction with the exhibit, we are developing programming around it. We've had 3 robust program events so far. This would be our 4th. This one is entitled "We Are," in parentheses, not all African. Presenters for today will be Dr. Fatimah Jackson of Howard University's Department of Biology, and Dr. Michael Ralph of NYU School of Social Sciences. Dr. Fatimah Jackson is a paleoanthropologist proper. Dr. Michael Ralph is a cultural anthropologist proper. Obviously, there's interdisciplinary crossover between the 2 fields, but I want to let them talk a little bit about their background. We're going to talk a little bit about their faith, their development. Dr. Jackson has a unique connection to Payne Theological Seminary that we'd like to explore, and yeah, we're gonna get right to it. So I'm going to let. So, Dr. Jackson, I'd like you to talk a little bit about your background first, what it is you do, and how you came to be a paleoanthropologist at Howard University.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me well? So I am, first of all, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to be with you all. I feel like it's a homecoming for me because my grandmother, Lenora Bell Johnson, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, St. Paul's AME Church, was very much involved in Payne Seminary and the Wilberforce University. So although I've not had a chance to visit, I feel a particular affinity to your institution and particular love grown out of being raised by my grandmother. So I am a biological anthropologist. I'm actually not a paleoanthropologist. I'm a biological anthropologist focusing mainly on temporary human variation. But in order to study contemporary human diversity, genetic variation, we have to be able to look into the past. And so paleoanthropology provides an evolutionary context around which we can evaluate modern human diversity. I trained at Cornell University. All of my degrees are from Cornell, and I've taught at for the last 40 years at a variety of predominantly white institutions. But I've been at Howard for 5 years, and it's been the most wonderful 5 years of my life because I feel like I'm really on my mission. It's at the point in my career and at the point of the technological sophistication where we're tying together all the loose ends and being able to make sense out of the human story. And the human story is an African story. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So this is the joy that we're able to talk about it in such positive and inclusive terms. So I thank you all very much for inviting me, and I hope to make a useful contribution today to today's discussion. Thank you.
Sure. So I'm Michael Ralph. I teach in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU as well as the School of Medicine. And my background is in anthropology. My research sort of overlaps with medical anthropology, political and economic anthropology as well. A lot of my early research was based in Senegal and sort of thinking through the idea of forensics and using it as a sort of theory of sovereignty, but ultimately using forensics to think about how the diplomatic profile of any country or the profile of any person is a forensic profile as well as a credit profile. I've also done research on slavery and incarceration and the relationship between life insurance and enslavement and actuarial science in terms of how people decide how much someone's life is worth. And so my most recent research explores the history of slavery and incarceration, arguing that it starts before the 13th Amendment, which people tend to focus on and thinking about the history of convict leasing. I would say, it's not quite a homecoming for me to be on the call, but it does feel like a family reunion. I guess I've admired Dr. Jackson's work for so long, and because my parents and cousin are both on the call as well. And I'm honored to be here today. I think as an anthropologist who works in Africa, and in particular someone concerned with the African diaspora, we think a lot of these questions of origins and what it means to sort of have your home or origins in one part of the world, be displaced, travel, migrate, make your way to another part of the world, to think about, moments when people of African descent are included in broader notions of human family, excluded from broader notions, sort of how contemporary technologies, as Dr. Jackson was saying, allow people to rethink their relationship to other people and other groups, and to Africa in particular. So I'm excited about the conversation. I look forward to seeing where it goes.
Mm-hmm.
Good deal. Thank you, presenters, for giving us insights into your background, into your research. And forgive me, Dr. Jackson, for introducing you as a paleoanthropologist. I didn't mean to claim your discipline to be elsewhere.
No, that's okay. We're all in biological anthropology. There are primatologists dealing with non-human primates, paleoanthropologists dealing with fossils, and human biologists dealing with contemporary humans. So you were in the right ballpark. It's just I'm not on first base. I'm over there on third base.
Gotcha. And briefly, if you wanted to, Mike and Dr. Jackson, actually, because you are both anthropologists, right? Anthropology is the umbrella that actually is over both your disciplines. Could you just briefly speak to what are the key intellectual distinctions that separate you, right? So what is the key underpinnings of cultural anthropology versus biological anthropology, and why are they both considered to be anthropology?
Well, I think when we were sort of introduced, I did my PhD at the University of Chicago, and actually my first job was at Cornell before coming to NYU, so that's another connection. But we're taught that anthropology has 4 fields, typically, like archaeology, linguistic anthropology, sociocultural, and then kind of physical anthropology, which can be sort of medical anthropology or even primatology, as Dr. Jackson was saying. And I guess, anthropology technically is like the science or the study of humankind, of human society. So we share that. But I also tend to think that, the person who initiated me into anthropology was Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, who was a anthropologist of Haitian origin. And, he's done a lot of work in history, and he studies the history of the Atlantic world. And when he was asked why he chose to do a PhD in anthropology rather than history, he said, because anthropology is the only discipline that interrogates Western categories of evidence. So I think that's interesting because, we could use different methods as anthropologists, but I think we have a kind of critical disposition so that we're always interested in how people talk about the world around them in relation to how that world is organized, and sort of exploring that discrepancy, like if, for instance, you'd ask people in the U.S. what kind of government they have, they would say it's a democracy, right? Each person gets a vote. And then you start talking about oppression and felon disenfranchisement and histories of poll tax and literacy tests, and you start to notice that the structure of voting doesn't match the discourse on what people say, what kind of society people say this. So I think to me, that's what anthropology is about, sort of putting those things in tension, sort of how we narrate the human experience with sort of how we organize our society. So, I think the differences in the specific field come down to which kind of evidence you prefer to focus on in the course of your research, which is why, as Dr. Jackson was saying, there are close relationships, but I think the evidence that you treat as primary, some anthropologists focus more on ethnography, some are more looking at fossil remains, some are looking at sort of osteology and human skeletons, and some are more looking at linguistic patterns and performance traditions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have anything to add to that, Dr. Jackson? It was very thorough. Thank you, Mike.
I totally agree. I think that Dr. Ralph has put it very succinctly. And I was thinking as he was speaking, what is it that unites us? Because for years I was in our anthropology department and it kind of felt a little alienated, but I'm in a biology department, and that's made me realize how much of an anthropologist I am. So it's the approach to the data, the critical approach, the interdisciplinary approach, and the fact that my biological studies are enhanced by a consideration of the sociocultural, linguistic, and archaeological data. And I would say that the sociocultural anthropologists their research is also enhanced by the biological data. And we have this fluidity to move between what otherwise people would consider distinctly different areas or fields of expertise. Because we are anthropologists, we've got a really wide umbrella, so we're protected from the rain, and we can move about quite a bit under that umbrella. I'd say so, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think like Warren should be commended for even sort of hosting this conversation, because I think I was struck by the fact, as Dr. Jackson was talking, I was sort of recalling that a lot of anthropologists in the 80s and 90s sort of split departments, like the physical anthropology department split from the cultural anthropology departments, and I think that has been in some ways detrimental to the field, because it is, as Dr. Jackson was saying, important for anthropologists to study language and social institutions to weigh in on the conversation about how we think about human difference, right? Like, what would it mean to only be studying sort of genetics or cells, and then from that try to extrapolate to human society, right? It's precisely because as a field we're all underneath this umbrella that we have a lot of sort of critical insights about sort of the distinctions between sort of what appears to us to be physical difference, and then also who we are as people and how we build societies together.
All right, thank you for that overview. Thank you for the compliment, Mike. But let's move forward to Dr. Jackson clearly wasn't playing today when she got some slides together. She wanted to make sure she has her points and her arguments and the information that she wanted to share, all her ducks lined up in a row, so to speak. So we're going to jump right into the presentation. Dr. Jackson, are you able to open up your PowerPoint and share your screen with the group?
Sure. Let me just hold on a second. Okay. Let me do the share screen.
And let me also say this. I don't know if that people are aware. Dr. Jackson is in Howard in Washington, D.C., and is actually good friends with the chief curator, Rick Potts, right? And is very familiar with both the standing human origins exhibit, right? The one that's at the National Museum in DC, as well as the traveling exhibit. So she's very familiar with the actual content that is in the Ransom Library right now, which is the traveling offshoot of the standing exhibit in DC. So I'm going to let her speak to that and any point she has in her presentation.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find this.
Cheryl.
I'm trying to find this. Okay, I'm in high five.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how to show these slides. So
the mouse around a little bit towards the bottom left, it'll say share screen. If you don't get it in a second, I'll jump in for you.
Yeah, jump in for me, because I did that, and I'm getting an offer to buy something.
No. In the high five screen itself, there's the black interface.
Okay.
So let's do something. Yeah. You should say share screen. If you just move the mouse around a little. Next to group chat, recording, share screen, move to laptop. No, none of that.
Yeah, I see that. But it says Open Chrome Web Store.
No. All right. All right. I'll do it for you.
Yeah. If you pull it up, I've got a paper copy.
I got it. No, I think here we go.
Okay.
So let me see if I can. Does everybody in the room see the slides?
Yes, we see my slides.
All right, so see if I can just know how to all right, so we'll do one more time and make sure. Sorry, I have to add people.
Okay.
Pick window, slides. All right, so the slides are up there.
Okay.
Now, if
I'll go to the second slide.
Okay, overview.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I'll just view. All right, I'll just. All right, so I guess just have to, not knowing exactly how to scroll through it properly, I'll just leave up the thumbnails as well as the main slide. So,
all right, that's fine.
All right.
So I'll just go through this very quickly. So this is the timeline for human evolution really is fairly robust now. In other words, we have a lot of empirical data. And this is why, you know, as a person of faith, I can't really turn away from the empirical evidence for human evolution because it's so abundant and it tells a plausible story that actually is quite compelling. So about 55 million years ago, we're picking up the first primates, and the primates show up along with a lot of other early mammals. The primates are among the first, and they what we call adaptively radiate, which means that they move quickly into the empty niches that have been left as a result of the demise of the big dinosaurs. And by 8 to 6 million years ago, we're actually seeing the first gorillas evolving. And then later chimps, and later after that, human lineages diverge. And don't worry about the scientific names here. I put them here just so that if you see them again, you'll recognize, oh, I've seen that name before. But Orin, Turigensis, and Ardipithecus, these are early proto-human types. They have a lot of traits that remind you a little bit of humans, but a little bit of gorillas and chimps. By 4 million years ago, we've got the Australopithecines, and they have brains that are no larger than a chimp's, a cranial capacity that's around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, but they walk upright on 2 legs. So what this tells us is that from the neck down, we evolve faster than from the neck up. And the savannas of Africa seem to be the major homeland place for these Australopithecines. And of course, by 3.2 million years, we've got the famous Deniquesh, the Westerners call Lucy. And this is the first specimen of Australopithecus afarensis found near Hadar in Ethiopia. And the Ethiopians call her Deniquesh, which I think is a pretty nice name, and consider her the mother of humanity. Then by 2.7 million years ago, we're picking up different varieties of bipedal hominids. They have heads of different sizes. They have different dietary patterns. So Paranthropus shows up. That's the robust Australopithecines. At 2.7 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago, we get our first Homo habilis, and we're Homo sapiens. So this is the genus Homo that leads to us. By 2 million years ago, we've got Homo ergaster, and I'm going to show you a picture of this in just a moment. But Homo ergaster has a much larger brain, and the one of the most famous Homo ergaster specimens that we have is a young boy who died, and had he lived to maturity, he would have been about 6 feet tall. So, you know, it's from the neck down, Homo erectus and Homo ergaster look very similar to us, but their cranial capacities are a little bit smaller. Their heads are a little bit smaller. By 1.8 million years, we've got Homo erectus in Africa, but also in Asia, and you probably have heard of Peking man or Java man. That's Homo erectus. And they lived there for a very long time. Meanwhile, while things are going on with Homo erectus in Asia, in Africa, evolution is continuing, and you get Homo heidelbergensis emerging in Africa and then moving into Europe. And by 500,000 years ago, half a million years ago, we see evidence of shelters, and humans are beginning to, or these early humans are beginning to spread around the world. But we get a big migration of humans a little bit later. I just want to point out that humans are hunter-gatherers at this point. We know that they're using semi-complex tools, that the Neanderthals have separated from the modern humans, and we start seeing Neanderthals appearing in Europe and Western Asia. Now let's look at the next slide. By 195,000 years ago, our own species, Homo sapiens, begins to appear in Africa. And soon after we appear, we start migrating. Subsets of modern humans start migrating into Asia and Europe, which we should properly call Eurasia. And the oldest human remains, however, are found in Ethiopia, in East Africa, and later on in Southern Africa. Then by 170,000 years ago, mitochondrial Eve, who you may have heard of, our earliest female ancestor of modern humans, appears in Africa. We go through this sequence again with humans developing fully capable speech and producing jewelry and complex symbolic art. And by 140,000 years ago, we're seeing clear evidence of long distance trade. Now, most of this is occurring within Africa, but around 60 to 70,000 years ago, we're seeing an influx, an exodus rather, of subgroups of Africans leaving Africa, going to populate the rest of the world. And that is followed in 50,000 years ago by what archaeologists call the Great Leap Forward, where you see a lot of cultural innovation in Africa, and then it spreads to the rest of the areas of the world where humans live. We see cave art by 33,000 years ago. Now, in Asia, Homo erectus is still there, while Homo sapiens is developing in Africa. But by 33,000 years ago, Homo erectus begins to die out. As these modern humans moved out of Africa, they encountered some archaic species like Neanderthals and Denisovans, and they encountered them in the Levant, in what we call the Middle East, but also in Southeast Asia. And it looks like we are a species, Homo sapiens, we're a species of lovers because we admixed with them, you know, and so we have hybrid individuals who one parent was Neanderthal and the other parent was a modern human. And they became integrated into the modern human population such that today we can find modern humans who carry small amounts of that Neanderthal heritage or that Denisovan heritage. Anyway, back to this. 18,000 years ago, we're picking up a very small species called Homo florensis, and they're found in the Indonesian island of Flores. They were very small, had small brains, but they had advanced small stone tools. So this tells us that there's a lot of diversity in the types of humans that were around at one time. Now we only have one type of human. By 14,000 years ago, we got modern people reaching the Americas, and they're still hunter-gatherers. But by 10,000 years ago, agriculture develops in many different parts of the world. You get domestication of animals, dogs, then horses, and so forth, cattle. And by 5,500 years ago, it's the end of the Stone Age. We've begun the Bronze Age. You're seeing complex societies. You're seeing guilds. You're seeing social stratification. And we're beginning to see the patterns of diversity that we now see in modern humans. Because initially, everyone looked like they came out of tropical Africa. But as groups moved into temperate zones and other zones away from Africa and in small groups, then their genetic compositions began to change. Let's look at the next slide.
So I'd like to have a question for you, Dr. Jackson.
Sure.
One, I just wanted to you beginning the chronology. You had said that as a person of faith, you're not going to ignore the empirical evidence
Yes.
science presents. So just briefly, you have speak upon your faith real quick. I see the hijab, I see the covering, but if you could speak about how your faith and your science are not in contestation, how you reconcile it, that obviously there's no rift in your mind for that, but if you could just speak about how your faith informs your life and how the empirical evidence of the science dictates your professional professional work and conduct.
Sure. Well, I mean, me and my family, we are practicing Sunni Muslims. We pray. We do all the things that Muslims are supposed to do. But we are also scientists. We, meaning myself and my husband and my kids too. We're all scientists. So we are very interested in integrating the science with our belief systems. I don't have multiple personalities. I just have this one personality. The way that I reconcile the Quranic message and the Islamic message, which actually is an extension of the biblical message, with the modern science, particularly the science of human evolution, is that I recognize that in my faith, some of the statements are factual and some are allegorical. And if I don't confuse the allegorical ones with the factual statements, then I've got a solid foundation for being both a functional scientist and a practicing Muslim. And the thing about Islam, because I grew up in an AME family, but I converted to Islam as an adult. And the thing about Islam in comparison to Christianity, perhaps, is that there's a little bit more flexibility, or it could be that I'm just reading the text in a more flexible way. But there's a little more flexibility because there's a little more ambiguity in the Quranic message with respect to the emergence of modern humans. So, for example, we will say that Allah created the earth in 6 periods. It doesn't say days, it says periods. So who knows how long a period is? That's only God knows how long a period. Maybe a period is millions of years, which would fit with the geological record. So I try to keep the religious ideas as a basis for my value system, and the scientific ideas as a basis for my factual knowledge. And where the two meet and coalesce, that's great. And where they don't, I kind of leave it up to Allah. You know what I'm saying?
Can I jump in here? When in doubt, leave it up to Allah is a good life lesson. I would say, my family, my parents, being from Guyana, they grew up in the Anglican church. And, when I was a young person, I sometimes went to Catholic churches. And ultimately, I graduated from Morris Brown College, which is founded by the AME Church, and currently my denomination is Orthodox, or like Tewahedo Orthodox, specifically from East Africa, Eritrea area. But I think there's that question of how our faith forms us, and I really like how Dr. Jackson put it, that your faith and your scholarship don't have to be incongruous, and the faith, it's not a scientific process, so it's not the same sort of question or same sort of analysis, that you would have when it comes to your faith. But I also think what was really important about Dr. Jackson's presentation is that it also shows the importance of religion for human society, or for human beings going back, thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. Because, when you look at the evidence, right, the archaeological record, part of why we know what we know is because we see jewelry. For instance, we see jewelry that is probably part of ceremonies, and we see pottery that's part of rituals. We see practices for honoring the dead. So we have this sense that for a long time, people had a sense of what's sacred, what's special to them. And when you think about society anthropologically, you notice that all human beings have processes for deciding who their representatives will be. Even today, we have elected officials take an oath, and even after the election, they don't really become a representative until they take an oath, right? And there are interesting fault lines around that, right? I remember when Keith Ellison, the political representative from congressman from Michigan.
Minnesota.
When he was going to swear in after being elected to office, and he wanted to swear in on the Quran, and people were like, "You can't swear in on the Quran. This is America, you know." And he said, "Well, I'm a Muslim, so swearing in on the Bible wouldn't mean the same thing." But ultimately, he resolved it by getting a copy of Thomas Jefferson's Quran from the Library of Congress.
Right.
And he swore in on Thomas Jefferson's Quran, which I guess was patriotic enough for people. But the point being that, you know, our religious rituals and ceremonies are even sort of as mundane as like swearing in of officials or swearing in of police officers and things like that. And it just goes to show that we're sort of religious beings, whether or not it's about the specific denomination we claim.
Wow. Right. Thank you so much for those responses. So we're going to explore the religious beings, and we're actually going to table one of my conversations that one of my questions out for you, Dr. Jackson, because I think is probably going to be answered later on in the presentation. So I'll let you get back to the PowerPoint and the Great Rift Valley slide we have here.
Okay, so this is just showing you the major sites where we have discovered the evidence for human evolution. Most of the sites, the oldest sites, are in Africa, and you know that's one of the things that I really like about Dr. Potts' work, is that he's worked extensively in Africa, and he's been part of a small but diligent group of researchers looking at Africa. And if we could have more people look at Africa, we would find even more evidence of human origins. But maybe that'll be the next generation. Let's look at the next slide. This is just the skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis. The Western scientists call her Lucy, from the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. As I mentioned, the Ethiopians call her Denekish, which means you are marvelous in Amharic, which I think is way more interesting than Lucy. But anyway, here's the artist representation of her face from the skeleton. Let's look at the next slide. And then this is the boy that I mentioned, the Homo erectus boy, the Turkana boy or Narakatome boy. And he was found dating at about 1.6 million years ago. And he was an adolescent male, when he died, and had the body shape of a modern human, but a smaller brain. Again, here's the skull on the side, and then here's an artist depiction of his face, and here's the entire skeleton. Next slide, please. This is the Homo heidelbergensis, and it's kind of misleading, the name heidelbergensis, because that's obviously a German name from Heidelberg, but the oldest evidence of Homo heidelbergensis was found in Africa, in East Africa, but the type specimen was found in Heidelberg, Germany. And this, again, you can see that, the skull is getting a little bit rounder, and the artist's depiction is based upon how we act, the genes that we think this individual carried. That is, that these people were dark brown skin and probably had curly hair. Next slide, please.
I actually want to stop right there for a second, because we actually had a visitor this past, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, that walked through the Explored Human Origins exhibit. They had a question about if this is an African story and we're talking about African beings and African fossils. All the depictions seem to have flat laying hair, right? That what we know to be kinky hair, right? More African texture of hair. Why is it that, as you see even in Homo heidelbergensis, right, the hair seems to be straight? Is there a kinky, lack of kinky hair representation in the fossils? Is that a
no, that's a lack of kinky hair representation among the artists. So we found the genes among the geneticists. So we found the genes for skin color, but we haven't found the gene for kinky hair. Now, probably because we haven't looked for it. And it may be that kinky hair is more recent, just like the very straight hair that we find in East Asians, that very straight, thick hair. We know the genetic basis for that. But to my knowledge, we've not found the genetic basis for kinky hair, probably because we haven't really looked at it. It has not been a priority of the researchers. Most of the researchers are Europeans and European Americans. So, this is another reason why we need to get involved in the genetic analyses of the traits that are most important to us, that we're curious about, because we know that these people were dark brown skin with dark eyes, because we can look at the melanin levels and the genes that are coding for skin color in these individuals. But we certainly don't know about the hair texture, just simply because we haven't investigated that yet. So these artist depictions you may find that in several years, Homo heidelbergensis will have a big afro.
So brother Homo heidelbergensis.
So now this is Homo neanderthalensis, and there's a lot of variability in the Neanderthals, but they lived in Europe and Western Asia from 250 to 28,000 years ago. So in evolutionary time, 28,000 years is no time at all. That's just like yesterday. We know that they started off in Africa, so they probably started off having a lot of African Africoid type traits. And then as they moved north and northward into Europe, and then eastward into Eurasia, they encountered different environments, colder environments, and a lot of the changes that we see in the Neanderthals appear to be in response to cold adaptation. So we see, for example, that they have a very robust skull, very big heads. They have round shaped thoraxes, so their chests are very round, short limbs, short fingers, and they became lighter. They lost their epidermal pigmentation, their skin pigmentation, as they stayed isolated in Europe and Western Asia. But there were different groups of Neanderthals, and so they may have looked different between each group. But the classic Neanderthals that we think of would have had lighter skin pigmentation, large noses to try to protect their lungs from the cold air that they were inspiring, slightly different vocal apparatus, so that their voices may have been more higher pitched than that of modern humans. So they must have really been something to see when those modern Africans moved into their regions and encountered these Neanderthals.
Dr. Jackson, I think you had mentioned in our previous conversation that there tends to be a emphasis in exhibits like this and the one in the Smithsonian on the Neanderthal evolutionary moment, because that is a link directly to the European ancestry. And if it's in fact European descendants, white Americans and Europeans leading this research, that they in fact would vault, right? They would hold up the Neanderthal focus in a ways that say someone who is concerned with the African evolutionary moments would not. Could you, is that a fair assessment? Could you speak on how the Neanderthals has taken a kind of Eurocentric position in this discussion?
Well, I think because the finding that Neanderthals contributed to the genetics of Europeans and some East Asians has made that species, Neanderthals, far more interesting to European Americans than would have otherwise occurred. And I don't want to fault people for being interested in their ancestors, because I'm interested in my ancestors. They just don't happen to be Neanderthals. So I thought that when we visited the exhibit in Washington, that the Neanderthal component of the exhibit, we thought it was huge. But of course, that's just our perspective. And when I talked with Dr. Potts about this, he said, oh no, we put a little bit in about it, but we tried to emphasize the African component. Well, for my money, you can't get too much Africa. So it's all a matter of where you're located. And I understand that in order to attract the bulk of Americans to the museum, they have to give them what they need to see. What they need to see is that, yes, their African connection, but also their their Neanderthal heritage, and they need to get as much of the big picture as possible, but they have to see themselves in it, and this is not unexpected. I mean, we usually criticize European Americans for placing themselves in the middle of other people's stories, but in fact, it's probably a very human condition, and we probably just need to, let them have their Neanderthals. Let them have their Neanderthals, because we can learn something about human evolution from including all of the relevant players.
Right. Well said.
Mm-hmm. And then here's the earliest anatomically modern human crania from Homo in Ethiopia, in southern Ethiopia. And this individual would have been very similar to us, but he's 195,000 years old. And this is the artist's depiction of what he may have looked like. Again, we're seeing curly hair here as opposed to kinky hair. But it may be that kinky hair evolved more recently. It's possible. And the thing is that Africa has people with all kinds of hair, the straightest hair, the straightest noses, the widest noses, the kinkiest hair, and the hair of the indigenous people from Southern Africa is like peppercorn hair. It looks like a little peppercorn because each hair follicle is so tight, it wraps around itself. So, there is a lot of variability in hair structure in Africa. But it may be that the kind of kinky hair that we see a lot in African Americans may have evolved, who knows, maybe within the last 50,000 years, 5,000 years. We just don't know. We need to do the genetic studies.
I think it's actually a really important point because I guess when people discover that human being, the human beings sort of originated in Africa, I think the assumption is that sort of the prototypical human being would have been someone really dark-skinned with like peppercorn hair, mm-hmm. and that all other hair textures and skin tones gradually evolved from that single prototypical ancestor. And as Dr. Jackson saying, well, even on the African continent itself, even at an earlier moment, there could easily have been variation in hair texture and in skin tone within Africa itself. So I think that is an interesting point,
mm-hmm.
just sort of the various factors shaping physiognomy.
Yeah, that's true. Let's go to the next slide. I think I've got this is just showing the migration patterns. So we have not adequately studied migrations within Africa, but you can see that we have migrations in and around Africa, and then migrations through two routes out of Africa, either going down the Nile, making a right-hand turn at the Suez Canal, no canal, but that's Suez, and going into the Levant, and then going west into Europe, or going east into Central Asia. Or we could have movements across from what is now Djibouti into what is now Yemen, across the Red Sea, the so-called southern route, into Arabia, and then following the coastline into Iran, and then down into India, and then on into Southeast Asia. The groups from Central Asia then subsequently migrated from Central Asia into the Americas, and again, most of them coming across the Bering Strait. But we also know that there were individuals who came from Australasia to South America. So, this story, we know that it's serial founder model. That is, that you have a starting population, a subgroup branches off, then that subgroup grows and expands, then a subgroup of the subgroup branches off, travels someplace else, they grow and expand. And the serial founder model is appropriate, but what we're just beginning to understand is that there's been a lot of movements of people from the New World back to the Old World, as well as from the Old World to the New World, you know. And it's just as we discover in the Americas, the place was not unoccupied. There were people here from other places, and they got replaced. In fact, some of these early migrating populations, they carried a very strong African signal, and then later on, they were supplanted by another group of people who may have been phenotypically, biologically modified. They were also African, but maybe they were now lighter complexion, or they had lighter color eyes, or lighter colored hair, or they were taller, or they were thinner, or whatever, okay? Maybe if we go to the next slide, I can show you what the genetic consequences of these things are. So the first two groups there, the green ones, the first are the Yoruba and the second one are the Luhaya from Kenya. They're showing more genetic diversity in the Africans than in the next population. The two orange ones are Europeans, and then the three purple ones are East Asians, two Chinese population and a Japanese population. So what this tells you is that there is much more diversity in Africans today than in Europeans or East Asians today, because Africa is the homeland of humanity, and there's been a greater opportunity for more mutations to accumulate. That's how you get the diversity, is through the mutations. So Africans still retain much more genetic diversity in every single system that we evaluate. Africans are more diverse than anyone else. And then let's go to the next slide. This is an important one because this is comparing the three population models that we've had just over the last 20 years. The racial concept is the first one in A. And what it says is there are Africans, there are Europeans, there are Asians. And there's a little bit of overlap between them, but not that much. They're essentially separate. So it's the racial concept of human variation. Then B represents the population concept. So when we started doing the genetic work, we began to see, hey, there's more overlap in these people than we thought. So you took that Venn diagram and kind of squeezed it in together, okay? But then the actual pattern of human genetic variation is represented in C, where everybody is African and Europeans and Asians are subsets of African genetic variation. Do you guys see that?
Yeah, right. Yeah. That's critical.
Yeah, it's really critical. And I always try to impress my students with this so that they understand that we are not a minority. We are part of the founding template for our species, Homo sapiens.
Can you track this chronologically as far as like intellectual history, when the diagram shifted roughly in
Yeah. So C, the actual pattern, we only really began to recognize that with the not even the Human Genome Project, more like the HAP map, which looked at variation, and then the 1,000 Genomes Project. So all of that has been within the last 10 years.
Oh, wow.
That's all, within the last 10 years. The essentialist concept, of course, goes back to, the 17th, 16th century. The population concept comes in with the emergence of population genetics in the late second half of the 20th century. But the actual pattern of genetic diversity comes right out of the actual testing of genomes. And at first in the Human Genome Project, they weren't including any Africans, and we blew the whistle on them about that. And then they said, okay, we'll make a hap map, but they included the Yoruba, and as that was the only African population. We said that's not enough, because wherever a species originates, you should find the greatest genetic diversity. So then they got to the 1,000 genomes, and they included maybe 2 other African populations. So they still haven't done us justice. But even with this little bit of knowledge, we know that everybody is actually a subset of African diversity.
So actually, Dr. Michael Ralph, I actually want you to comment on this one. So as an Africanist, as a person that studied histories of race, studied how concepts of race have been utilized as tools of oppression, as tools of enslavement, as tools of incarceration. I want to, Dr. Jackson has put on the table a lot of the way the science, right, the biology, and how the Human Genome Project has shifted this conversation. But I want you to talk to it from a humanities perspective, right? That to me, this essentialist concept of race, as that's put forth and upheld, that's how you right can in fact justify the colonization, the enslavement, right, of another race, because they are essentially different than you, right? They are subhuman. Right. They don't belong to your same circle on the racial Venn diagram, so to speak, right?
Right. Yeah. I appreciate the question. What I think is interesting about the actual pattern of genetic diversity, is that in a way, this is another place where sort of religion kind of blends well with science, so to speak, in the sense that, it really was, I think, a certain kind of religious understanding of all people being created by God or something like that, that led a lot of people to insist on a kind of shared notion of origins, and that itself matches the scientific record that, like, all people must come from the same source, if in fact all people are the same and all people are God's people, so to speak, right? So, like, as Dr. Jackson was saying, one way to think of that would be like to say, like, well, yeah, all people were created at the same sort of ancestor, so to speak, right? And I think what's interesting about the population concept, or the essentialist concept, in particular the essentialist concept, is that there are all kinds of projects tied to it. Some of them, as you suggested, are, that kind of idea obviously surfaced as a justification for slavery and colonialism. If in fact someone is part of a different conception of humanity, or not even human, it's easier to justify treating them in a dehumanized way: slavery, incarceration, colonialism. But I think even in our contemporary moment, there are versions of the essentialist conception of race that are meant to be flattering, right? Like, there's even a sort of way that the idea that African Americans, because of things like enslavement, or the transatlantic slave trade in particular, are almost constitutionally different from anyone else, right? That, like, there's nothing, like, the Black experience in the New World is so different that there's something fundamental about it, right? That, like, there's a lot of even histories of slavery that incorporate almost a kind of theory of Black subjectivity, that, like, slavery was so cruel and dehumanizing that the problem of Blackness that it leaves in its wake is something we have to struggle with. It's not even amenable to policy and things like that. And so what's interesting about that is that sort of floated and discussed as something, even potentially flattering or something unique, but it actually maps onto a really conservative and insidious argument about exclusion, because, in the aftermath of emancipation, if all African Americans needed was jobs, access to jobs, and access to decent healthcare and decent living conditions, and they could thrive, which history bears out, then it'll be easy for us to sort of become more mobile socially. But there's a way that, like, new arrivals to the U.S., European ethnic minorities, were given access to job programs and decent housing and decent wages. And the problem, Negro was framed as something really unique and distinct. Like, well, the Negro is such a peculiar kind of creature. Job programs won't work for him, and decent schools won't work for him, and decent housing won't work for him. We don't know what to do with the Negro. And there are even versions of African American studies today that promote an idea that's almost something like the Negro condition is unique and special and distinct. That it's not just a social and historical condition, but like an existential plight, you know? And I think that that's a kind of really dangerous argument to take up, because its implications are that if, you know, what do you do with the people for whom policy does not remedy their condition, right? If better schools and better access to jobs won't do it, then what, you know? Then what? Special ed, incarceration, menial labor, you know, other kind of solutions are proposed. So I think this actual pattern of genetic diversity is hugely important, because what it suggests is that, you know, African people of African descent, being just like other people, is a kind of political and economic infrastructure that makes it difficult for African people to thrive. But there's nothing sort of constitutionally about Black people that prevent them from performing well in society, all things being equal, you know.
So one because I know you've done work in this area, I actually do want to talk about phrenology real quick as a historical project that you know is hinged on this essentialist concept of race. Dr. Jackson, if you want to say something about that as well. But we have all these replicas, right, of fossils and remains, and not too long ago in the distant past, people would hold these fossils up to talk about right, the inferiority, the subhumanity of a particular skull structure, right, that they had identified with being African. I think most recently in pop culture, for those who've seen Django by who did Django? It was Quentin Tarantino, right? Quentin Tarantino, and there's a scene, right, where Leonardo DiCaprio's character is holding up the skull, right, and talking about you know, why we are enslaved, why, right, these black brutes are about to fight for his entertainment, because if you look at the skull patterns, right, Africans are in fact inferior. So I just wanted to, you know, not delve into that too much, but when we're talking about how concepts of race are formulated, we can't you know, disconnect ourselves that all these you know, the replicas and these skulls that are in our building, right, in the Ransom Library right now, have been in not too distant past used as tools to justify the subhumanity and the subjugation of African peoples. So if you could just talk to a little bit about the history of phrenology and you know, kind of how the sciences were actually hinged on that for a while and then moved away from it.
Well, I thank you. I mean, I think that the history of phrenology, because it's looking at the skull and it's really craniocentrism, I would say, is a reflection of the Western European emphasis on the head, and that the head is somehow more important than the body. And it speaks to the Cartesian dualism, where the mind is different from the body, and that the idea is that the bigger the head, the more intellectual, the more intelligent the being is. And of course, Morton was the famous pseudoscientist who looked at crania, and he was sure that men were smarter than women because they had bigger heads, and whites were smarter than blacks because they had bigger heads than black people. And then lo and behold, he got a hold of some Chinese skulls, and the Chinese had bigger heads than the Europeans. So the question was, oh my God, what to do now? So he employed what we called a fudge factor, and to compensate for the larger heads of the Chinese compared to the Europeans. So, you know, this overemphasis on cranial capacity, cranial shape, size, and so forth has been a long-standing theme in Western science. I would like to say, though, that with respect to the actual pattern of genetic diversity, of course, we find that a lot of cranial size is a reflection of cold adaptation, so that people in colder climates tend to have bigger heads so that the brain can be better innervated. That is, you can get more blood to the brain to protect the brain from cold stress. So it's something as simple as that. But when I look at this actual pattern of human genetic diversity, I also would like to point out the huge area in orange that is not covered by either the European or the Asian patterns of diversity. This is genetic diversity that exists only in Africa. And what it means is that the loss of this diversity is an incredible loss for the entire species. So the C, diagram C, puts into real context the impact of HIV/AIDS and malaria and all the other diseases affecting disproportionately African descended populations, especially continental African populations. And the fact that we're not mounting 1,000% effort to save those populations means we're losing that genetic diversity, which means once it's gone because we don't know how to make new genes. We only know how to take existing genes and take them from one species and put them in another species. But we can't make up this new variation. We don't have the technology to do that, to make up the extensive pattern of African genomic variation that has evolved over 7 million years of hominid residence in Africa. So I'm not saying that we're more important than other people, but I'm just saying that Africans have a lot more diversity. And if diversity is the hallmark of evolutionary viability, then we've got a lot more evolutionary viability. So if we lose that, the species suffers more than if we lose the bulk of European diversity or the bulk of Asian diversity, because it's already present in Africa, as you see.
That's a very thorough response. Dr. Ralph, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I really like the response. I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
I think we've got one last slide to show.
One slide, yep.
Okay. So this was my last slide, and it's just a reminder that we all descend from African migrants. And if I can tell you that in 2000, the year 2000, the Chinese scientists in the People's Republic of China were having a huge nationwide discussion over, were they derived from Africans or were they derived from Homo erectus? Homo erectus that was found in Asia. And, you know, their leading scientists said, we don't have anything to do with those Africans. We're derived from our own Homo erectus populations in China, you know? And it took a molecular geneticist from China, Dr. Lei. He was the one who evaluated the Chinese molecular genomics and discovered that they were Africans, that underneath all of the changes that had evolved in in China, underneath that, they were fundamentally tropical African beings coming out of Africa. And so I remember writing a paper saying that the Chinese had a problem of the color line, because this was in response to the anniversary of W.B. Du Bois's famous statement about the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And I said that the Chinese still had a problem of the color line, but they resolved it through science. They resolved it by scientists that they could trust from their own community, who evaluated their genetics and found the African in them. So I like this slide where everyone descends from African migrants for the 2 points, for the African part, but also for the migrant part, because people tend to think that somehow they've been in a place for 10 years, so they're indigenous. And it's like, no, we're all migrants, you know? So I just wanted to point that out in this slide.
So, all right. So thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'm going to give the round of applause for all the muted mics out here, but thank you. Thank you, Payne Theological Seminary. Thanks for your thorough presentation. So I'm going to I want to focus on one aspect that's come up a couple times in this conversation, but it's often a question that people have when they walk through the exhibit floor, and it is where is God, or where God isn't in this particular discussion, right? We had talked about how your faith and your the empirical practices you use as a biological anthropologist are not in contestation. However, right, this is a seminary, right? The exhibit was chosen to be at a seminary for a reason, and so the discussion of how our faith informs our humanities is central to what it is we want to bring to light with the exhibit. Again, not to discount or to minimize the empirical data here. We just want to get a sense of, if we were to insert a faith conversation into your presentation, where would it be, right? I think in our initial conversation, I had asked about homo religioso, and if our religion is something innate to humanity, if it's built into us, right? Is there somewhere on the chronology, if I went back to slide 2 or to slide 3, right? Is there evidence for where religious practices, where religion kind of started to take hold in the human evolutionary movement?
Clearly we can look for physical things like burial of the dead, or just development of certain symbolic units that people use, symbolic items. But I believe, you ask, where is God? God is throughout this whole evolution. There's a place in Mexico on the Yucatan Peninsula, and I frequently like to go there to the beach. It's called Progreso Beach, and I go there just to thank God for the meteor that hit the planet, that threw up the cloud of smoke, that destroyed the dinosaurs or reduced them, so we mammals had a chance to survive. And, so I go to Progreso Beach and say, thank you, God, thank you. Because without God's intervention, there's no way that we would have evolved. And at every single step, the odds were against our species ever coming into existence. And so to me, where is God? God is throughout this exhibit, through every single step, through every innovation, through every domestication, through every new tool that's made, and I know that the people, the early humans, had to develop not a religion, they developed a spirituality. I'd like to distinguish between those two, because it's not the formal religion that's important. It's the spiritual nature, the connection to the deity that has been right beside us as throughout our human evolution. And just one more thing I'd like to say, and that is AAAS has been running these sequences on science and religion. And I told them probably should be science and spirituality. But they said, why at Howard University do you not have a conflict between science and religion? And I said, first of all, spirituality is way too important for us to give it up just to science, because science only deals with a narrow part of our existence. There is more to life than just what can be measured. So the importance of religiosity, or the importance of spirituality, really cannot be discounted. And the other problem is that science, Western science, is still retaining remnants of white supremacy. So there's no way I'm putting both feet in the science plot. I have to keep one foot on the ground, and my spirituality makes up for some of the deficits in science. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth on science and spirituality.
Just out of curiosity, we talk about burying us burying our dead, right? That there's a ritual around a graveyard and honoring those who passed. Where on the timeline would that be roughly?
I think I've got it here on the next slide.
Next slide.
Yeah. Okay. So let's see. We're seeing Let's see, burial
50,000.
50,000 years ago. Yeah.
Forward. So the great leap forward 50,000 years ago, that's where we start to see human evidence of human beings burying and ritualizing their dead.
Right.
And that indicates the concept of the beyond, right? That why would you do that if you did not have a notion that there's something after death?
Well, you might put them in the ground because they stink, but but why would you put important tools and animal bones and valuable stuff in the grave with them? So it's the grave goods more than just the burial of the individual, of the deceased individual.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the period right before that that's marked on the timeline, 140,000 years ago, is also important because evidence of long distance trade means that people are in communication, corresponding with each other. It means that they must have ways of greeting each other, must have recognizing who each other's authorized representatives are. They have customs, I'm sure, and conventions and norms they follow when they meet. They have rituals, like ways of eating together. They learn each other's habits. So that's a kind of religious framework as well, learning someone else's culture and customs and way of being. But I do think that death is an important site of religious meaning and belonging because if you think about what it means in practical terms as well, how do people put together a ceremony to honor that person, right? Like a funeral, it's a sort of social endeavor. How do people provide for the family that suffered the loss? How do people share resources in the aftermath of a loss? So much of even what we think of as like African-American social aid, pleasure clubs, fraternities, sororities, mutual aid organizations arose out of the practical function of pooling resources in a time of crisis or a time of loss, paying dues so that you have a pool of resources to draw from in the event of crisis or loss. So that's so essential to what it means to form human society and organizations that it's also sort of not a coincidence then that churches and religious organizations play such a pivotal role in those dynamics as well, right? Like that often it's the church family, church community that comes together in the event of crisis, in the time of need. So I think that, one way to find God is to find sort of, as Dr. Jackson was saying, like, I think first, as she sort of very artfully put it, in the kind of daily aspiration to explore the world, to create a better world, to provide for your family and community, that suggests a kind of optimism or faith. To go out into the world and believe you can find what you need is a faith, right? So waking up every day and aspiring to find things to be better, like believing that there are things out there to find is a kind of faith, right? Because if you didn't believe you would be successful in that, you wouldn't bother to do it. So, but I think that connected to these sort of sacred rituals and customs suggests that the way that human beings have thought about religion is sort of much more holistic and comprehensive than the sort of religious divisions we tend to focus on.
Right. I agree.
So that was a great, those responses I think we're going to actually take under what is the subtitle of this exhibit is what does it mean to be human, right? All our events, all of our discussions, that is always going to be an undergirding theme. So everything we're trying to strike at through the exhibit, through the conversations we're having. Obviously, that's an age-old question. There's no direct response to it. However, I think that what we were just discussing is something that does in fact separate humanity from other species on this earth, right? That this deep sense of cosmological belonging, right? That is not just a terrestrial need, right? We don't just bury our dead because the need to, not attract predators or just to get rid of the stink, right? That there's something that's in our consciousness that is cosmic in nature, and therefore we're going to ritualize our dead in a fashion that makes us distinct from other species on this planet. Even if we share 98.6 of the genetic patterns of chimpanzees, right? Chimpanzees don't ritualize and honor their dead in the fashion that we are seeing to begin in this great leap forward of 50,000 years. So that's a correct assessment, Dr. Jackson?
Yes, I think that's a correct assessment. And And we're still evolving. That's the other thing I want to make sure we understand, and that your listeners understand. We're still in the grip of human evolution. We haven't stopped evolving, and there are no Stone Age people left anymore on this planet. The Stone Age ended 5,500 years ago. There have been dramatic changes in the existing population, but there'll be more changes coming in the future too.
Right. So that's, thank you, Dr. Jackson, for that. Just to also get at this, what does it mean to be human? I think, Mike, I like the way you talked about this aspirational, this getting up every day, right? That there's that faith can be an integral component to leading us forward. One thing that I learned from this exhibit, right, I think is through Homo erectus, right? Standing upright. And I take that as both literal and metaphorical, right? That humanity is an aspiration towards standing erectly, right? That it's not simply about the spinal column and the needs to be a biped and this kind of, biological reduction, but there's also this, we must stand upright, right? In terms of character, in terms of aspiration, right? That we have to be forward striving, aspirational in our humanity, that the humanity is in itself an aspirational quality. So I see that, if there's anything else that I think we touched on a couple of things, but there's something that you feel distinctly makes us human that anthropology informs, or anthropology questions, let's say, if you wanted to bring that to the table, we'd like to hear what you have to offer.
Yeah, I mean, even what you just said, I think is a great expression of that. The thing I would say is, I think as anthropologists, besides taking a critical posture, I think we're always interested in human ingenuity, like people being imaginative and creative. And I think from our perspective, people are always being imaginative and creative, and people are always doing a lot with a little and always finding new solutions. As Dr. Jackson put it so well, like we're always evolving, which means always adapting, always being strategic, and then also sort of like making time for rituals that matter to us. But I think the ingenuity thing is important because, even in what seems like the darkest, most dismal moments, like enslavement, incarceration, we see extraordinary genius, art, insight, literature. We see that come out of all kinds of things. Even when people seem to be most oppressed and obstructed, they find ways to create genius. So I think to do amazing things, remarkable things, I think that's part of what makes us human. As you were talking about aspiration and uprightness, I was thinking about like the Jordan logo, the Michael Jordan logo, and just basketball as a sport, and just aspiration more broadly. Like there's so much you could do with the idea of aspiration and how much it matters to people to strive, and how much people sort of channel their resources and efforts towards striving. And then I think the other side of that coin would be making sure that the institutions are set up to foster and reward that, because I think the story of human society is less impressive than the story of human evolution or something like that in many ways, right? That like, despite the fact that all human beings are always sort of striving, right? There are all kinds of traps people fall into, right? Like opportunities are not distributed evenly, and things like that. So I think that's it. That's the other part of it. Like people find ways to hoard, defend, and guard resources. People find ways to sort of, going to the point that Dr. Jackson made in the beginning. Like one feature of the human condition is sort of selfishness or something like that. So people wanting their property, their wealth, their influence to be reserved for their family or their cohort, their community, right? Like there are people who, particularly in New York where I live and teach, people who would embrace the broader notion of all humanity, but like fight you in the street if you try to desegregate their schools or something like that, because they would be concerned about bringing down the standard and the property value and all kinds of things, right? So I think that's the other side of, this sort of question that we have to be really attentive to, because it can easily be too abstract how we think about human striving and achieving, and not not paying enough attention to the kind of obstacles that are sort of inadvertently left in place or deliberately put in place.
Thank you. So I feel like we're going to have like maybe a 10-minute spillover in time because the conversation is so robust. There seems to be a lot of callers and participants on here, and I want to be able to field a few questions from the field. I said one or two callers. Anyone that's on the call, feel free to type your question in the chat box for Dr. Jackson and Dr. Ralph, and we'll be sure to get to a few quick responses as we can. Dr. Ralph, you had mentioned something about the darker side of humanity. I actually want to touch on that because it's something that I was actually thinking about recently in the wake of the mass shooting in New Zealand, right? And obviously one of the ones that affected us here at Payne, the Charleston shooting, Mother Emanuel, right? Yeah, the one in Texas. You have Sandy Hook, right? And it started, I think we were both in high school at the time when Columbine started, right? But I couldn't help reflecting on that a little bit as a potential response to what does make us human, because I don't think you see this type of wanton violence that makes absolutely no sense as far as what you would consider normal lines of violence that we see in nature, right? Because animals will certainly, right, predators will kill their prey, right? We consider that to be, right, quote unquote, an act of violence. You see animals that will protect their herd or their territory, right, against potential offenders, but that in itself is still an act of that act of protection is self-sustaining, right? They must either preserve the land or preserve the herd in a particular way that will violence is provoked, right, by impeding forces or other animals, other species. But we've never seen like a chimpanzee or any other species just go somewhere they are not being threatened by. There's no provocation, right? There's nothing that says that this particular clan, this particular herd of in the nature sense, this herd of animals is a threat, and yet they go on this premeditated, right, entirely irrational exhibit of violence just to I don't know, some ideological to make an ideological stance, right? And so, right, how much does violence make us human? Because what we're seeing, right, Sandy Hook, New Zealand, Mother Emanuel, Texas, right, people in prayer, right, people in complete passivity are being slaughtered, right? And so to me, that seems a new, we talk about human evolution, that seems to be a new defining characteristic, because in the past, right, if we think about violence, it's usually, right, war, there's this kind of geopolitical nature to the violence, right? It might be soldier on soldier, right, nation state versus nation state, right? How is this civilian dynamic of slaughtering innocents inform, right, our humanity from a darker sort of, right, less aspirational and more base stance?
Well, with a question like that, you may get some hot takes in your last 10 minutes, but I'll just say I actually tend to think that human beings are usually pretty logical. So even when we think about violence as senseless or illogical, it's often not, So one of the most distressing parts of the Mother Emanuel massacre was that, these people were in the middle of worship and welcomed someone in and he slaughtered them. And I think that, the language is sometimes used in sort of far-right, alt-right circles is a kind of language of race war. And it's a language that is often dismissed or easy to dismiss as fanatical, delusional. But it is also interesting to take seriously that was a discourse around even during the time of legalized slavery in the U.S. that some of the founders, so to speak, from Thomas Jefferson to Henry Clay, people who would say that they disagree with slavery in principle, but were fine to leave it in place for a time in practice, sometimes talked about how if slavery was to be abolished, they feared violent uprisings and reprisals from African Americans, you know? So I think that discourse has been around for a long time, actually, this idea that somehow there is a race war underway or something like that. And I guess it's like an extreme version of the essentialist conception of race, right? An extreme version of that is that there's a kind of fierce competition for resources, and certain groups are actually highly militarized, highly organized, and well-funded and invested in securing those resources for the groups they feel like they belong to. So as distressing as it is, I wouldn't say it's illogical, but I would say that it requires imaginative and sort of really conscientious people to create policy and to create education systems that channel people's thoughts and energies in other directions. You know what I mean? Because like maybe if resources were less scarce, there'd be less fierce competition. Maybe if people were more well aware of what it is that unites us as human beings, they would be less prone to those ideas. I think there's all kinds of ways to think about policy and practices that would channel people's energy in other directions, but I do think it takes really good policy to save people from themselves, you know? I think that like the sort of pettiness and the greed and the selfishness and the violence that we see is human. It is human, right? But I think that in places where people aren't panicked in the same way and aren't in competition in the same way, they don't unleash violence in the same way. And, you know, even sometimes, I mean, so I'll just say that I think sound education and health policy goes a long way, you know, to encourage people to focus on what it is that allows people to thrive and prosper, as opposed to sort of unleashing violence. But I'd be interested in what Dr. Jackson has to say as well.
So I agree, Dr. Ralph, with the things that you said. I think it's really a dilemma. Now, this issue of violence in other species, especially in non-human primates, is something that has been investigated. We do know that non-human primates you can get packs of chimpanzees, for example, that will go after rhesus macaques, and we have video of them actually tearing the animals limb from limb. And we also have quite a bit of group violence in some of the advanced primates. So I think that we've inherited our homicidal tendencies, honestly, that the homicidal tendencies we've had have paid off when we were hunter-gatherers, and when you feared the other person, you know, you feared the stranger, and it paid off to be xenophobic. The problem is that we're in the 21st century, and we can't afford to be xenophobic. We can't afford to have a society built on ethnocentrism. We've got to have a society built on merit, and we have to somehow make it possible for all kinds of different looking people to optimize their intellectual and physical abilities. We don't have that kind of society yet. But I did want to tell you something that I think is relevant to both the religious and spiritual perspectives on humans, as well as our own perspective, scientists. And that is this frontal area of the bone, your forehead. So this forehead area has undergone the most dramatic change in the skull during human evolution. You know, not the back of the skull, not the jaws, not the nose, but the frontal area. And so in Quran, in Islam, we have where God is saying that he's going to grab the sinners by their lying, sinful forelocks. So like we would read this and say, what the heck are they talking about? Why is God always talking about the lying, sinful forelocks? Then the neurologist came in and explained to us that right behind this frontal bone here is the executive section of the brain. So this is the part that is becoming more and more enlarged as our heads get taller and as this front part begins to stick out. So this part of the brain, the frontal part of the brain, is where your value judgments are located. This is the executive part of the brain. So it's almost as though in the course of human evolution, we became a more conscious, more moral creature. Now, this is why we're still evolving, because we haven't reached it yet. And I still worry about the mass killings and the ability of people to hate on a rumor. You know, they'll kill somebody on a rumor. But we hope that the evolution will continue, that especially this frontal part of the brain, where right behind our foreheads, that part will continue to grow and expand and become innervated, and that we will mature as a species so that we can learn to get along with each other, that we'll develop a greater tolerance for diversity. You know, because we got pretty good tolerance for people who look like us. Although I don't know about, sometimes with our own people, we hate our own people more than we hate everybody else. But, you know, the fact is that we are evolving, and there's always hope that we will become better people. And I think that that's really the function of religious practices. Religious practices are supposed to make the practitioner a better human being, a more compassionate human being, a more tolerant human being, and a less demanding human being for the resources of the planet.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jackson. And with that, I'd actually like to segue into the crowd a little bit. The callers have stayed on. I think a few are getting dropped from technical difficulties, but everyone seems wrapped by the conversation due to the fact that no one is left. So I'm actually just going to open up the floor a little bit. Dean Miller, Michael Miller, if you're there and you can turn your mic on. Maybe you and Dr. Charles Brown have a question you'd like to.
We're here.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, so either in direct response to what Dr. Jackson said about human evolution and religious practices make yourself a better human being. I know that's something that is critical to the work here at Payne and critical to your work here as an academic dean, to develop the complete human being through their seminary education. So if you want to speak to that, or if you just had another question that was, something we've touched on in the course of this presentation that you'd like to ask for either Dr. Jackson or Dr. Ralph, we'd love to hear.
Well, I have some thoughts, but I know Dr. Charles had a question.
Yes. I'm particularly interested in...
Could you lean into the camera? I want to see you. Yeah, I can hear, but we can't see you. Just lean in Dr. Miller's direction a little bit. There you go. Yep.
Okay. I'm particularly interested in the role of community in this process of evolution. We are preoccupied. I mean, our society is preoccupied with the notion of individualism, which gets in the way of developing the kind of moral sensitivities and practices, habits that Dr. Jackson was talking about, when she was talking about how we might evolve morally. So I'd be interested in your responses to that.
I mean, what I think about sometimes is sort of how, I guess, as we evolve and adapt and we develop instruments that are beneficial to us, I think it's important to think about this question of community and take it very seriously. I mean, for me, one way to think about community is sort of accountability. It's also about sort of leadership, right? Like, who are the leaders in your community? Who are the people who are your teachers, and guides? And like, if you think about something like, for instance, one of my research projects is about life insurance, and most Americans did not really come around to the idea of life insurance to like the 1830s and 40s. And interestingly, insurance on enslaved people evolved around the same time, because after the slave trade was ended in 1808, and a lot of people who owned slaves would rent them to companies. These enslaved people acquired skills that made them really valuable. And before people would rent them out, they would insure them because they had these amazing skills. They didn't want to lose the value of them, like blacksmiths, carpenters, cooks, and things like that. But I think for instance, for free people getting life insurance is great. It's good to have resources to be able to leave your family, but it's not the same as like a mutual aid society, right? Where you pool resources. It's not the same as a community organization that will take care of your family, that will look out for your family or something like that. So I think, to your point, as we evolve, it is important to not just think of the individual, like, okay, this is how much I make on the job, and therefore this is how much I'll take a policy out for, but also like, what is it that I really need to thrive in? How do I benefit from immersing myself in a community that can attend to all kinds of things I may not be thinking of when I just reduce myself to my salary or what I think of as my special gifts, So, I mean, I don't exactly have so much as a question as maybe as students of history, we can look back and say that strong communities and collectives are essential to success and progress, right? It's like, it's not really the individuals that make the difference, although we focus on the individuals. It's really the sort of communities, right? Whether it's like, I was reading something about Scott Woodson, who we think of as the father of Black history and founder of Black History Month, etc. But he was apparently he had Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston as research assistants one time, and he was complaining that Zora Neale Hurston was embellishing and her ethnography and things like that. But I just thought, like, what an amazing fact that he had that Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, he was training them. They were his graduate students, people working under him. It just goes to show you like the power of community and network and tutelage, right? Like, they wouldn't be who they were if they didn't work directly with Carter G. Woodson. And, at Payne and elsewhere, and Morse Brown, certainly at Howard, that's like the history of our people, sort of like, really pulling together and working hard and supporting each other. And that makes our success possible. So it's I think it more as a comment than a question. I think it's very important.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the community has been absolutely essential for the survival of our species, because when you look at us, we're kind of weak individuals. First of all, we don't have any claws. we don't have big canine teeth. We're not that strong. But when you put us all together, like, we can really destroy some stuff, So the thing is, in the scientific community, group selection has not been studied extensively. In fact, there's almost a prejudice against group selection. It's almost as if my colleagues don't want to admit that the group has been the major factor for their rise to prominence as white people. I'm just saying, they say, oh no, I did it all by myself. I did it it was just me, myself, and I. No, sorry, it was you and white privilege and that whole big group effort that you had standing behind you, that the police officer who didn't arrest you for speeding, the court system that gave you leniency, the
home loans,
the home loans, all this stuff. All that is the group selection that makes it easier, that Dr. Ralph was talking about, that influences our difficulty. It has been our curse as well as our strength. Our strength, we African Americans have pulled together, and it's been our curse when we've confronted the wall of white supremacy and white racism, which is a group event more than an individual event. So I think a community has been essential in human evolution, and I think it's been understudied because of the political ramifications for contemporary populations. But regardless of whether it shows the real basis of their success or not, the truth is that community involvement is fundamental to human survival. And the worst thing that would happen to us as African Americans is to lose our sense of community, to lose it even more than what we've already lost.
Thank you for the question, Dr. Brown, and the responses, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Ralph. I'm actually going to take a question. I see Dr. Jim Miller from the Smithsonian. I want to make sure we get a Smithsonian representation in here. I don't know if he could unmute his mic. He might have left.
May I make a comment as another Miller? May I stand in this place?
Sure. Go ahead, Dr. Miller.
Okay. I'm fascinated with discussions about the trajectory of human evolution at this time, and given my readings, I'm not a scientist of any kind. My own conviction that in fact it is as Teilhard, I'm sure you know Teilhard and his bad reputation in your field. The idea that it is in the noosphere, in the mind sphere, that evolution is occurring at this time. And I was very happy to hear Dr. Jackson speak about the executive function of the brain. I remember reading about, is it Robert Sapolsky? You would know him better than I do, the Stanford guy who researched the baboons is it in Kenya?
Yes.
And discovered that when through tragedy, the alpha males were eliminated from the community, the whole character of the community changed. The pecking order, which had the more dominant and violent, and which traumatized everybody else.
Yes.
Once they had left, the whole structure of the community changed. There was greater harmony. There's greater cooperation among the males and among the males and the females. Which for me is a good example of what happens when we pay attention to the social structure in which people are socialized.
Yes.
And you spoke about the executive functions, and what happens, as you know, when the limbic system is also affected, and all of that fear and anxiety through trauma is diminished, which otherwise challenges the operation of the executive function. And I'm wondering what you think about its implications for how the way we organize community among Black people who are traumatized people, generally speaking.
Yes.
How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that we are. I'm impressed that we're a people who are still trying to find our way.
Right.
As far as how are we going to organize ourselves to optimize who we actually are. That I think that we have followed the Eurocentric model, perhaps blindly at times, but we have to figure out what is going to work the best for us. And for me, that's one of the very positive aspects of the Black church, is that the Black church gave African Americans an opportunity to create something that was their own. Now, it wasn't totally independent of the European American church, but it nonetheless, it had elements of it that spoke back to West Africa or Central Africa. So figuring out what works best for us really needs to be a target of study for African American intellectuals. You know, we're counting on people like Dr. Ralph and other very bright people to kind of tell us what are the options and then what's going to work best for us. And so we can try them out in places like Payne Seminary and so forth. We have the religious message, but how do we craft the religious message to affect our souls, to affect our behaviors? How do we craft how do we create a community that is sustainable, you know? And we have to think about what are the long-term goals here? You know, we have a lot of things that divide us that I would hope that a renewed sense of community would begin to address, like the hostility between Caribbean and African Americans. That's a fake hostility. There's no basis for it. You know, we're the same people, we're from the same places in Africa, and we just had different Europeans and different Native Americans that we interacted with, but we had the same conditions, essentially the same conditions. And so how do we create a 21st sense of community, 21st century sense of community that is going to address all of our pervasive problems and take us into the 22nd century? Because I don't see that yet, you know. I see that the remnants of 19th and 20th century organizations, but I'm not seeing 21st century organization, community organization that is really going to propel us forward. But I know that it's out there, and our social scientists can help us, and our social scientists can help us, and the biological scientists can tell us if there's any analogs in other species, for what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight. I was just thinking as you're talking about the community we hope to build. I was thinking about I've taught in prisons and things like that, and when you look at the statistics for education and incarceration, there's a stat that if someone even takes one college class while they're incarcerated, the rate of recidivism drops 50%. If they go on to do a BA, it drops dramatically again. And if they end up doing an MA after they come out at some point, it drops to 0. So that's kind of fascinating that the more education you get after you're incarcerated, the less likely you are to have any more problems to ever be locked up again or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it suggests that that's a very fruitful path for us to pursue as educators, or for people who sort of been incarcerated, that they're getting an education, taking classes, it will be beneficial ultimately. And, that's our community as well. And, here we come up against other kinds of problems, like do Black colleges or would certain universities want to bother with prison education programs, or scholars, do we make time for something like that? As people in our community, are we ready to support people when they come back home? Can we support them when they're inside, et cetera? There are a lot of questions to be asked, and it requires a lot of work and a lot of coordination. But I think it's worth considering, right, that there are people in our community with all sorts of skills and resources and potential, and for various reasons they've not had the opportunity to use it yet, or could benefit from, and we could all benefit from helping create more opportunities for them to use their skills.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So in the interest of time, thank you for those responses. And we're going to just put you on the spot real quick and ask, we'll start with Dr. Jackson. What does it mean to be human, Dr. Jackson?
Wow. Let's see. To me, to be human, I cannot come up with unique biological features. So to me, to be human is God consciousness. That to be conscious of God is perhaps the thing that we know for sure is seen most pronounced in humans. We have hints of spirituality in other animals. That elephants behave a certain way around the deceased elephant, and that even chickens will behave a certain way tending to their young. So there's instinctual behavior. But there's something about God consciousness. We call it in Arabic taqwa. So there's that, to me, is the essence of being human. And I'm encouraged in this because I've noticed as I talk to colleagues who are Buddhists and practice Confucianism, that they will say when they see bad behavior, they say, "Are you even human?" So it suggests that it's our behavior, our consciousness of there being something greater than us that may be the foundation of us being human. And that goes back to the increase in the frontal bone, the growth of the frontal part of the brain and the frontal bone, that frontal area where values and morals are located, that growth through the course of human evolution may have been what made us more human, because it wasn't bipedality and it wasn't just having a big old head. It was it was our behavior, So that's my nutshell definition of what it means to be human. It's taqwa, it's God conscious.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like that. I like that explanation, because I was going to say, to me, what it means to be human is to be imaginative and to be compassionate. And I think that what Dr. Jackson says, it really captures that even better, because, what is imagination? What is creativity besides divine insight? A lot of people who are creative, they discuss it like it's not even like they feel like they're creating something. They feel like they're sort of realizing something, channeling something. There's a way in which it is God consciousness that you're working with when you're creating. and that is also what links us to each other. This idea that we're all the same, that we're all created the same. So I think from the imagination and compassion. So yeah, I mean, I really like the idea of God consciousness as what makes that's who we are. It makes it what it is.
That's wonderful. So we're actually going to conclude today's event. There were a few questions that came in the chat box. If Dr. Jackson, Dr. Ralph, I'm going to email to you. We had one from Jim at the Smithsonian. I think Dr. Michael Ralph Sr. had a question that seemed pretty intriguing. So I'm going to ask for just some emailed responses to those three questions that popped up in the chat box, just as a brief follow up to kind of keep. Not to feel that we didn't address some of the questions from the crowd. So I'll email those to you, and we'd appreciate a response. And like all events here at Payne Seminary, we end in prayer. So I'll give a closing invocation. Dear God, dear Allah, to all the gods that have brought us here together today, gods of the AME Church, to the spirit of Richard Allen, the spirit of Daniel Payne. We come humbly before you, and we thank you for creating this robust around heaven. We thank the Smithsonian, thank the American Association, we thank the Templeton Foundation for all their sponsorship in this exhibit, being here at Payne Theological Seminary to create this meaningful dialogue. We hope that all of our listeners and all of our participants today were impacted, not deeply impacted at the soul level, at the God consciousness. Continue their work, to be upstanding, to walk upright, to cultivate their faith, become better human beings. Thank you all that you do in our daily life, and we thank you for this moment, this conversation, that we are, parentheses, not all Africans, and the intellectual section of that meeting that we had today. So we thank you, and the church say amen. And
Amen.
Thank you for everything, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Dean Miller, faculty, to all the callers and participants today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. And yeah, we'll have a brief follow up. I don't want to think this is ended, but Dr. Jackson gave a very full and thought provoking demonstration.
Thank you. It was fun. We should do this more often.
Yeah, man. We're trying to navigate. I like the whole webcam. It does give us a little bit of flexibility in our schedule, right?
Yeah. Take care. Thanks for everything, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for everything.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Dr. Holly, hello.
Hi, how you doing?
We are well.
This was very good. Oh, I mean, Warren, I tell you, you're a great facilitator.
Oh, no worries. Thank you.
It was awesome. I enjoyed the whole presentation.
Thank you so much.
Ralph, good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon. How are
Good
you?
afternoon, Dr. Jackson and Dr. Ralph.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Ralph.
That's the parents of Dr. Michael Ralph. It's Dr. Ralph Senior.
Enjoy your presentation.
All right.
All right. Thank you all. God bless.
Oh my God.
Bishop Lord, good seeing everybody.
Yep. Thanks, man. Thanks for joining.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Glad you could make it.
Yep. All right. Thank you.